At 63 years old, I sold the company I had spent 31 years building from nothing, and I decided to celebrate with my son and his wife over dinner. He smiled. He raised his glass to me, and then, when he thought I wasn't paying attention, he reached into his jacket pocket. What my son didn't know was that someone else in that restaurant had been watching the whole time. That quiet warning from a stranger was about to set in motion something I never imagined I would have to do to my own child. Before I go any further, I want to ask you to tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe that a man's legacy is measured by what he builds in his community, not what he hands off to people who never earned it. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The restaurant sat right on the waterfront in Kingston. It was the kind of place where the lake caught the last of the evening light and turned it into something almost impossible to look at directly. My wife Patricia had always loved that particular stretch of the waterfront. In the 38 years we were married, she must have walked it with me 1,000 times. Losing her to ovarian cancer 2 years ago had left a silence in my life that I still hadn't entirely learned to live inside of. My son had suggested the restaurant himself. He said it felt right to celebrate there, somewhere meaningful. At the time, I thought that was a kind gesture. I thought a lot of things about my son that evening that I later had to revise entirely. He and his wife arrived 10 minutes after me, which was unusual. They were both dressed as though the occasion called for it, which it did, though something about the precision of their appearance struck me as rehearsed. My daughter-in-law kissed my cheek and told me I looked wonderful. My son gripped my shoulder and said he was proud of me. The words were right. The warmth behind them was not quite there. Or perhaps I simply didn't want to see what I was already sensing beneath the surface. I had sold Morrison Building Supply to a regional chain that had been circling the company for the better part of 3 years. The final number was $3.2 million, and after taxes and the lawyers and the financial arrangements, I was left with something that would be comfortable for the rest of my life, provided I was sensible. I was 63 and in reasonably good health, though my cardiologist in Kingston had put me on a low dose of Ramipril for blood pressure the previous spring and told me to be careful about interactions. I had a printout of the prescription in my wallet, as I always did. The meal started pleasantly enough. My son talked about his work, which had been slower than usual that year. His wife talked about renovations they were planning, a sunroom addition on the back of the house that she described in considerable detail. I listened and nodded. There was something beneath both conversations that I kept nearly grasping and then losing. The way you sometimes sense a word is on the tip of your tongue before it disappears entirely. Halfway through the main course, my son excused himself to use the restroom, and my daughter-in-law followed a moment later, saying she had spotted a friend near the bar that she wanted to say hello to. I was left alone at the table with the soft sound of the lake outside, and a glass of sparkling water that the server had brought, without being asked. I sat there thinking about Patricia. She had never trusted my son's wife, not fully. She said it politely, the way Patricia said most difficult things. She told me once, about 2 years before she got sick, that she thought my daughter-in-law kept a running tally in her head of everything she believed was owed to her. I had defended my daughter-in-law then. I had said Patricia was being uncharitable, that young people today had different pressures than we had. Patricia had simply looked at me with that steady gaze of hers and said nothing more about it. That was the other thing about Patricia. She knew when to stop. A man materialized at my elbow so quietly that I startled slightly. He was perhaps mid-50s, wearing the dark uniform of the restaurant's floor staff, with the kind of posture that came from decades of professional service. His name badge said Robert. He had the expression of a man who had measured very carefully how much he was about to say. He leaned down, and his voice was low but completely steady. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, sir," he said. "I'm the sommelier here. I was behind the service station when your son came back to the table a few minutes ago. He set something down on the edge of your glass. It looked like a small paper packet. He was looking toward the back of the room when he did it." I looked at the glass in front of me. Robert straightened slightly. "I thought you should know," he said. "I'm sorry." He turned and walked back toward the service area, unhurried, as though he had simply come to check on the table. My son and daughter-in-law were still at the far end of the room. I had perhaps 90 seconds. I have spent 31 years running a business. Which means I have spent 31 years making decisions in the few seconds between when a problem becomes visible and when it becomes unmanageable. Every instinct I had told me to do nothing visible. I looked at the glass. I thought about the prescription card in my wallet, the warning my cardiologist had given me about Ramipril and certain over-the-counter combinations, and I thought about my son's questions over the past several months, asked too casually, about my will, about what I planned to do with the proceeds from the sale, about whether I had thought about putting the money into a family trust while I was still around to administer it. I picked up my napkin, knocked the glass over with what I hoped looked like carelessness, and watched the water spread across the white linen. While the server hurried over and the brief commotion gave me a half-second of cover, I palmed the folded napkin and tucked it into my inside jacket pocket. It was damp and cold against my chest. My son appeared at my shoulder. "Dad, are you all right?" "Getting clumsy in my old age," I said, and smiled at him, and watched his face very carefully as he smiled back. I stayed at the table for another 40 minutes. I drank the replacement glass of water the server brought. I talked about the company sale, about my plans to travel, about whether I might buy a smaller place on the water somewhere. My daughter-in-law mentioned 3 times, in 3 different ways, that Patricia would have wanted me to be generous to the people who loved me. Each time she said it, I agreed pleasantly and thought about the napkin inside my jacket. I told them I was tired and called for a cab, turning down their offer to drive me home. My son hugged me in the parking lot, and I let him. And I stood in the cold October air and watched their taillights disappear, and then stood there a moment longer before I got into the cab. I did not go home. There is a private diagnostic clinic on Princess Street that has been open for emergency appointments since I used them years ago during a workplace incident involving one of my drivers. I walked in with the folded napkin sealed inside a plastic sandwich bag from the cab driver's glove compartment, which he gave me without a word when I asked. The technician on duty was professional and unhurried, and asked no questions beyond what he needed for the form. I left my number, drove home, and sat in the kitchen in the dark for an hour before I could sleep. The results arrived by encrypted email just after 6 the following morning. The substance detected was amlodipine. It is a calcium channel blocker used for blood pressure and angina. The concentration in the sample was approximately 4 times a standard therapeutic dose. The technician's note was brief and clinical. In a patient already prescribed Ramipril, particularly one with a known sensitivity profile, a dose of this magnitude introduced without the prescribing physician's knowledge would carry a significant risk of acute hypotensive crisis, presenting symptoms consistent with a severe cardiac event or sudden collapse. There would be no reliable way to distinguish it from a spontaneous medical emergency without specific toxicological testing at autopsy. I read the report twice. Then I made a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat looking at the kitchen window while the light came up over the neighbor's roof. Patricia had always said I was too slow to anger. She meant it as a criticism in smaller moments. The times I let suppliers overcharge me, the times I let difficult conversations pass without addressing them. But in larger moments, I think that slowness was the thing that had kept Morrison Building Supply alive through 3 recessions and a flood that took out our main warehouse in 2011. I did not make decisions when the emotion was running. I made them after it settled. What settled in me that morning was not rage. It was something much colder and much more precise. My son had come to that dinner with a plan. He had sat across from me and raised a glass to my health. And he had put a substance into my drink that could have stopped my heart and allowed him to collect the proceeds of everything I had ever built. He had done this because he believed he needed the money more than I needed my life. I called my lawyer at 7:30. Margaret Chen had handled my business affairs for 18 years. She was 60 years old, relentlessly methodical, and constitutionally incapable of panic. She answered on the second ring. "I need to see you today," I said. "Bring your best investigator contact. This is not a business matter." There was a brief pause. "I'll cancel my 9 o'clock, she said. Her office was on the top floor of a building on Ontario Street, and by 8:30 I was sitting across from her with the lab report on the table between us. She read it once, looked up at me, read it again, and then set it down very carefully, as though it were something that required handling. "I want to call the OPP," she said. "I know you do," I said. "David." She used my first name, which she almost never did in this office. "This is attempted murder. This is the kind of file that gets prosecuted." I told her what I had told myself in the kitchen that morning. A charge, a trial, a publication ban that might or might not hold. The name Morrison attached for the rest of its existence in this city to a story about a son who tried to kill his father at a waterfront restaurant, Patricia's name in the newspaper. Everything I had built becoming a footnote to something monstrous. Margaret sat back and studied me for a long moment. "Then tell me what you want," she said. "I want to know everything," I said. "I want to know their finances, their debts, every account, every arrangement. I want to know what they're planning and what they've already done. And then I want to use all of it." She turned to her computer and reached for her phone simultaneously, which was a gesture I had seen before in difficult moments. "I know an investigative firm in Ottawa," she said. "Former RCMP. They're thorough and they're quiet. I'll have them on this by noon." I played my part for the next 10 days. My son called each morning, his concern perfectly calibrated, asking about my health and my sleep and whether I had spoken to Margaret about the trust documents. I told him I was moving slowly. I told him I was still tired from the excitement of the sale. I mentioned twice, in passing, that I was thinking of setting up a significant family trust and that I wanted him to be centrally involved. Each time I could hear the shift in his voice, the slight brightening, the careful management of his own enthusiasm. The first report from the investigators arrived on the 8th day. My son and his wife carried a combined consumer debt of $230,000 across 7 credit cards. The cards were from the major Canadian banks, all of them at or near their limits. The account statements the investigators had obtained through legal channels told a story I recognized from the outside, though I had never looked at the numbers directly. Restaurant charges in Ottawa and Toronto, a ski week in Whistler in February, a renovation deposit on the sunroom that had apparently been placed and then refunded 3 times in 2 years, which suggested it had been used as a rolling credit maneuver. They had a house in the west end of Kingston, worth approximately $600,000 at current market, with a first mortgage and a home equity line of credit that together represented nearly 90% of the property's value. They were 2 months behind on the HELOC payments. A letter from the financial institution was already on file with the credit bureau. My son's vehicle was leased. His wife's vehicle was financed. Both were in arrears. The total picture, when Margaret laid it out for me the following morning, was of 2 people who had been spending approximately $40,000 a year more than they earned for the better part of 5 years, sustained by minimum payments and the belief that something would eventually change the equation. Something meaning me. I sat with that for a day before the second report came. The second report was shorter and worse. The investigators had followed a thread from my son's phone records to a series of calls made over the previous 4 months to my registered financial advisor's office. The calls had been made using my daughter-in-law's cell phone. In 3 of the calls, she had identified herself as calling on my behalf, claiming that I was unwell, and had authorized her to request information about the composition and transfer options on my RRSP account and my non-registered investment portfolio. The combined value of those accounts at the time of the calls was approximately $800,000. My financial advisor, who had known me for 12 years, had not released any information and had noted the calls in my file as suspicious. He had not contacted me about them because he assumed I was aware. He was wrong about that. I thought about Patricia again. I thought about her standing at the window after one of my daughter-in-law's visits. Her hands folded in front of her, looking out at the backyard with that particular stillness she had when she was choosing not to say something. I should have listened more carefully to the spaces in her silences. The third and final piece arrived 2 days before I had scheduled the meeting. It was a document, a copy of a continuing power of attorney for property filed with my primary bank branch in Kingston 7 months earlier, granting my son full legal authority over all financial decisions, in the event of my incapacity. The document bore what appeared to be my signature and had been witnessed by two individuals I did not recognize. I have signed a great many legal documents. I am familiar with the movement of my own hand. The signature on that page was not mine. The investigators had traced the document back through the bank's filing system. It had been submitted in person during a branch visit my son had made on a Tuesday morning in late March, while I was in Toronto finalizing the terms of the sale with the acquiring company's lawyers. He had brought a notarized copy of what appeared to be my identification. The bank teller who had processed the document was a junior employee who had not flagged the submission for secondary review. 7 months. While I was closing the largest deal of my life, while I was sitting across from lawyers in downtown Toronto, negotiating the terms of everything Patricia and I had built together, my son was in a bank branch in Kingston arranging to own me. I called Margaret. "Get the room booked for Thursday," I said. "Tell them Margaret's office is finalizing the trust documents and she needs their signatures on some preliminary paperwork. Tell them to come ready to celebrate." The morning of the meeting was gray and cold in the way that late October in Kingston can be, the kind of gray that settles in early and doesn't lift. I arrived at Margaret's office 90 minutes before my son and daughter-in-law were expected, and we sat together at the long table in the conference room going over the order of everything. Margaret had 5 folders on the table in front of her chair, each one precisely aligned. She was wearing the same expression she wore when she had once told a supplier's legal team to take their amended contract and put it back where it came from. We did not talk much. There was nothing left to plan. They arrived at 10 o'clock, and they arrived as I had expected them to arrive, with energy and color in their faces. My daughter-in-law in a coat I hadn't seen before. My son, with the particular looseness in his shoulders of a man who believes the difficult part is already behind him. He hugged me at the doorway. It was only the second time in perhaps 15 years that he had initiated a hug, the first being at the restaurant 2 weeks earlier. My daughter-in-law kissed my cheek and said I looked rested. Her eyes moved past me immediately to the folders on the table. They settled into their chairs across from Margaret and me, and there was a brief, pleasant exchange about coffee, which the assistant brought, and then the assistant left, and the door closed behind her with a quiet, final sound. Margaret did not warm up slowly. "Before we address any documents," she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of complete professional control, "there are several preliminary matters that require your attention." The shift in the room was immediate. My son's posture changed. My daughter-in-law set down her coffee. Margaret opened the first folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a toxicological analysis performed by an accredited private laboratory on a sample collected at your dinner 2 weeks ago. It identifies a concentration of amlodipine approximately 4 times the therapeutic threshold. The laboratory's clinical notation indicates that this dosage, introduced without a prescribing physician's knowledge into a patient already on Ramipril, carries a substantial risk of acute hypotensive crisis indistinguishable from a spontaneous cardiac event." My son looked at the report. He did not speak. Margaret opened the second folder. "This is a consolidated financial assessment of your current liabilities." She slid it across. "It details a combined consumer debt of $230,000, a home equity line of credit in arrears, and a current deficit between your annual income and expenditure of approximately $40,000 per year over the past 5 years. A notice of intent from your financial institution regarding the HELOC is included at the back." My daughter-in-law had stopped looking at the table. She was looking at my son, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen there before, something stripped of the usual performance. Margaret opened the third folder. "This is a transcript and call log from 4 separate contacts made with my client's registered financial advisor between June and September of this year. In each contact, the caller identified herself as acting on my client's behalf and requested information regarding his RRSP account and non-registered portfolio. No information was released. All 4 calls were flagged and logged. There was a sound from my daughter-in-law. A small, involuntary sound that she cut off quickly. Margaret opened the 4th folder. She placed the copy of the power of attorney on the table and let it sit there for a moment. This document was filed with my client's bank branch in Kingston on the 29th of March. It grants full authority over all financial decisions to his son in the event of incapacity. She looked at my son steadily. My client did not sign this document. He was in Toronto on that date. The signature has been examined by a forensic document specialist, whose report is attached. The silence in the room had a weight to it. My son's hands were flat on the table. His face had the quality of a man sitting in a car after a collision, still processing the fact that the motion had stopped. I spoke for the first time. There won't be a family trust, son. My voice was quiet and completely even. I had been a business owner for 31 years, and there is a register you find after enough difficult conversations, below anger and beyond patience, where the words simply carry what they need to carry without any additional weight. The $3.2 million was transferred into an irrevocable charitable trust 3 weeks ago. It's called the Patricia Morrison Foundation. Margaret filed the papers with the Canada Revenue Agency on the 12th of October. The foundation is already operational. I watched their faces. Margaret continued. The foundation's mandate is to provide trade scholarships for young people in Eastern Ontario and to fund palliative care programs at Kingston Health Sciences Centre, specifically in the oncology ward, where Mrs. Morrison received her care. The principal is protected. The distributions are already scheduled. There is no legal mechanism by which either of you can access, challenge, or redirect these funds. The foundation is managed by an independent board with no family representation. My daughter-in-law put her face in her hands. My son looked at me, and there was something in his expression that I had not seen since he was perhaps 12 years old. Something raw and undefended. It did not change what I had to do. You have 2 options, I said. Margaret will go through both of them. I want you to listen carefully, because I'll only say this once, and I mean exactly what I say. Margaret took the final folder. Option 1. We conclude this meeting, and within the hour I will deliver the complete evidentiary package to the Kingston Police Service. This includes the toxicology report, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the documented contact with the financial advisor. The charges would likely include attempted murder, fraud, and criminal impersonation. The evidence is substantial. You would both almost certainly face prosecution and, if convicted, custodial sentences measured in years. She paused and let that settle. Option 2. You sign the agreement in this folder today. It is a legally binding document prepared under Ontario estate law. You will relinquish all current and future claims against my client's estate. You will transfer the deed of your home to the Patricia Morrison Foundation, which will assume the outstanding mortgage and HELOC balance. The foundation will not pursue recovery of the home equity line arrears. You will have 30 days to vacate the property. You will cease all contact with my client, with any person connected to his financial or legal affairs, and with any institution that holds accounts in his name. In exchange, my client will not file charges. The evidentiary package will be held in secure escrow by this office and released to law enforcement immediately and automatically if any term of this agreement is violated. My son said, very quietly, "Dad." I looked at him. I had thought about this moment many times in the 2 weeks since the restaurant. I had imagined what I might feel, what I might want to say. In the end, I found I had nothing to add. The man across the table from me had come to a dinner to celebrate the end of my working life and had tried to arrange the end of my actual life. The gap between those 2 facts did not leave room for a conversation. The agreement or the police, I said. It took 12 minutes for them both to sign. My son read the document once, slowly. My daughter-in-law did not read it. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote her name. They left without speaking to me again. I stood at the window and watched the street below while Margaret gathered the folders, and I listened to the sound of the building settling in the cold air. And I thought about Patricia walking the waterfront, and I thought about 31 years of early mornings and difficult decisions and the specific weight of a company that you have built with your own hands. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the particular exhaustion of a long job completed correctly. That was 4 months ago now. I am in the habit these days of spending Thursday evenings at the Trades College on Battersea Road, where the Patricia Morrison Foundation has its first cohort of scholarship recipients, 8 young people in their first or second year of electrical apprenticeships and carpentry programs, most of them from families that would have found the tuition difficult. I sit with them sometimes in the common room after the evening session, and we talk about the work, about the things that go wrong on a job, and how you handle them, about what it means to build something that has to last. One of the scholarship recipients, a young woman from Napanee who is in her second year of electrical training, told me last week that she had been about to drop the program for financial reasons when the foundation letter arrived. She said she had read it 4 times before she believed it was real. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about what it meant to put 3 decades of work into something and have it go. In the end, not to the person you spent your whole life assuming it would go to, but to a stranger on Battersea Road who read a letter 4 times because good news had never quite arrived that easily before. Patricia would have had something to say about that. She was practical and clear-eyed, and she had a gift for identifying exactly what a situation actually was rather than what you wanted it to be. I think what she would have said is that the money found its right place, which is probably the most that can be asked of any of it. I did not find peace in the way I expected to. I found something different, something closer to clarity. A legacy is not the total of what you accumulate. It is the specific shape of the choices you make when those accumulations are finally on the table and the people around you are showing you clearly who they are. My son showed me who he was. I showed him who I was. The foundation is doing the work now. There is a particular Thursday evening I keep returning to in my mind. The 8 of them around the common room table at the college. The late autumn light coming through the high windows, someone's coffee going cold on the edge of the table. One of the young men had asked me what the hardest part of running a business was, and I had said, without thinking about it much, that it was learning to act on what was actually in front of you rather than on what you wanted to be there instead. He had nodded and written something down, which I hadn't expected. I am still not entirely sure what I was hoping for when I sat down to dinner that October evening in Kingston. Something from my son that had been gone. A long time, most likely. Some version of the boy he was before whatever happened to him happened. But you cannot negotiate the terms of a person who has already decided what you're worth to them. What I know is that when the moment came, I acted on what was actually in front of me. I kept the foundation. I kept the scholarship cohort. I kept the Thursday evenings on Battersea Road. I let the rest go. If this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one.